could be called European history of religions. It's rather a German thing. So in the German study of religion, Europäische Religionsgeschichte used to be a big thing for a while. I think now it's fading again. But still, Helmut Zander is one of the key authors in this field of research. I will only mention 3 monographs that came out of this interest. One is History of Soul Wandering, Seelenwanderung in German, it would be translated as Reincarnation in Europe from 1999. A second pivotal book is called Europäische Religionsgeschichte, religiöse Zugehörigkeit und Entscheidung, Konsequenzen interkulturellen Vergleich from 2016. And finally, currently press is a new work that builds on the monograph on Europäische Religionsgeschichte called Religion und Politik in Christentum und Islam, kulturelle Grammatiken, Fachdispositionen, Entwicklungswahrscheinlichkeiten. This is in press, right? It will appear in 2025. Then the second big body of work of Helmut is related to anthroposophy, and this is really where he kind of shaped the field or even created it with his habilitation in 2000, which he finished in 2002. There was hardly any anthroposophy research going on in Germany and beyond, and so he kind of started that field and continued it ever since. Out of his habilitation came a big 2 volumes called Anthroposophy in Deutschland, Theosophische Milieus und gesellschaftliche Praxis, with 1,800 pages. And then out of that came the biography of Rudolf Steiner in 2011. And since then, he is the expert of anthroposophy, and he's also much interviewed, and he appears in a very interesting 3-part documentary on anthroposophy as an interview partner with very short but concise statements, I would say. And then another fruit of his articles is that he's also the editor of a book series called Okkulte Moderne with Dick Wolter since 2016. And I could go on and on, but I think I stop here and let Helmut Zander begin his talk. Welcome, Helmut.
Christian, for this kind invitation. And I've heard a lot of AC, and now I know it really exists. Really nice to meet you, and I hope we'll have a fruitful debate. I presented something of my hobby horse, because anthroposophy is just on the margins of my scholarly interests, but I like it still. And I hope you enjoy some reflections which I'll present in the next, 3/4 of now and now. I hope you have a handout on your notebook. If not, you might ask for a printed version, but you should have the online version. It just helps you not to lose me. And there are some, I think we are speaking about the most important esoteric association in the world. It's always difficult to measure, but I think it's really important. And the question which is on the table today is what happens to this tradition, which is deeply coined by German tradition in the process of globalization, which is going on since, let's say, 50 years. I realized in preparation that the topic, because there is nearly no research on these things, some exceptions exist. I'll show you them later. So I present you a collection of wild impressions and cloudy reflections, and we might discuss on these topics later. I would like to start now with just a small didactic enterprise. I would like to ask you, if you hear anthroposophy, what you are thinking about, and I have to take my glasses since I have some problem with my eyes. So you might start what you are thinking about.
Demeter, Waldorf-Pädagogik,
Great.
Eurythmie.
I didn't understand the thing you just said.
What?
Eurythmie? Eurythmie?
Eurythmics.
Yes.
This movement thing they do in China. Music back. Great group.
Excellent. Other meetings?
Rudolf Steiner schools. I had friends who had their children go there, and another who did the jump.
Yes.
And it's, I mean, ideology.
Gelida and Dr. Rausch.
Wow. Yeah, cosmetics.
For me, I know it was also from reading Steiner, but also in Israel with the anthroposophical schools. And what I understand from them is the strong connection of human beings with environment, with nature, and not being human beings. So, anyway, holistic approach.
I'm doing field research on anthroposophical groups in Argentina, and I have some friends that are part of our research team, and they are from the Waldorf system, and they are studying to be teachers of communities. So it's wonderful.
Yeah, we have a lot of Waldorf schools in India now, so yeah, it's experiential learning. I think that's what I personally think about agriculture, especially in the south of Germany, which is quite popular, like so-called Demeter, and also recently the anti-vax protests during Corona and the entanglement.
Okay. It's a very unusual situation that nearly everybody has some idea of anthroposophy, but you don't. we like minorities.
I'm here for.
So in any case, that we belong to some extent to a milieu which is the ground of anthroposophy. So there might be not only scholarly, but also, well, a social, a social comprehension between us and them. So what's anthroposophy? Basically, as you mentioned, Rudolf Steiner, but this complex field based on Rudolf Steiner is so complex that I tried to give you just overview with three main points. That means anthroposophy without sentences, you find them on the handout. First, there is a supernatural world. That means that's the anti-materialist bedrock of anthroposophy. Second, you can recognize and experience this supernatural world, and everybody has the ability to gain super sensible knowledge. And third, you can apply these findings, these ideas practically, and that's what you're talking about, really, the schools, agriculture, Europeans. I speak mainly about practice outside of the esoteric school of these ideas, how to gain higher knowledge. It's just a question of limiting the scope of my presentation. Globalization, that's a process which is going on since the 1970s. And I just show you a diagram, the schools which exist worldwide, and it's not really necessary to interpret these findings in detail. It's clear that the process of globalization we speak about is quite young development. Currently, we have 256 schools in Germany, more than 1,200 schools worldwide, and about 2,000 Waldorf kindergartens, and the numbers increasing. I go into just some details. You see, there is a center of schools in Europe. It's still a European-based worldview, and that's very clear. Like this nice picture, you see a big bubble that's still European West. What I find interesting, if you look on the MENA region or Northern Africa to, let's say, Pakistan, you have nearly no anthroposophical institutions and schools in Islamic countries, or at least very few. We might discuss the reasons for that later. The last perspective in this first point introduction, to what extent does anthroposophy belong to esotericism? And but if you know me, I'm always engaged in this question to define esotericism or not. I don't do this here because anthroposophists don't have real problems to be integrated into an esoteric field. Steiner used the term quite rarely, but he uses it. He prefers terms as occultism, secret science, supersensible knowledge, theosophy, gnosis. Without going into details, I think anthroposophy is part of the field which we label nowadays esotericism. Second point, background, Rudolf Steiner. He is the main reference, the venerated master. He is the central, the linchpin of anthroposophy. And I just give you some hints on his biography in constructing the 4 periods. There's a first period, which, and you find periods on your handout, which we might call childhood and youth. I would say 3 elements are central. He is imbued with nationalism, he's fascinated by technology, and he receives only superficial religious education, if at all. Then we have formative years. They start in Vienna, when he studied, well, sciences, and which continued in Weimar, where he became editor of some of Goethe's, well, scientific works. And he's engaged with Johann Gottlieb Fichte, and these two, Goethe and Fichte, they become part of his philosophical ideas. I don't go into details, but one element is absolutely central, and it remains the center also in his theosophical period. He's a monist. That means matter is for him just another form of spirit. They are interchangeable. And he integrates in this monism an idea of thinking, denken in German. That's a universal thing. And if you have access to thinking, denken, you are universal, and you have no limits of knowledge. That's the idea which continues throughout his life. You must create an option that knowledge is no more limited. That's a huge topic. You might discuss historicism, colonialism, globalization, but just keep this point clear. He wants to attain a knowledge without limits. We must add in this time his engagement in science, especially in theory of evolution. He accepts this theory after it has become popular in Germany. And finally, just before 1900, there's a big crisis in his life. He loses his faith in idealism. I think he became more or less an atheist. And that's a situation when his 3rd period began. It's the encounter with Theosophy. He meets Theosophists in Berlin just in 1900, and he began to read a huge mass of theosophical literature. He writes a theosophical anthropology, titled Theosophy. He writes a cosmology, which he calls occult science. He creates the esoteric school, which I don't want to treat too much today. He integrates visionary concepts, Freemasonry, etc. In this context, Steiner adapts racial theories, which are up to now one of the difficult issues in the field. And finally, I would say he creates the German Theosophy. It's a mixture of German philosophy and theosophy in the tradition of Annie Besant. Annie Besant is the key figure. He breaks with her in 1912 about the personal Christianism. And after the First World War, the last period begins in my quite simple construction. He is engaged in practical fields. And all these things which you mentioned just now at the beginning, schools, medicine, caring for handicapped people, cosmetics, chirurgery, and so on and so on, agriculture. These are all results of the years after the war. He dies in March 25. Next year we have the anniversary of his death, and big things are coming. So, third point, another background. The global situation in. I just got to show you some pictures. That's Steiner in the years about 1890, when he was on the way of losing his ideal faith. He became an admirer of Nietzsche, and he wrote some scriptures in this tradition. So that's an extremely interesting photo because Steiner accepted, as he said, that the photo would be taken with him in the state of clairvoyance. The state of clairvoyance. And that's the height of the period where he was deeply convinced of all these philosophical stuff. So, Anthroposophical society. There's only one text which I consider to be acceptable in our scholarly community. That's the text of Ansgar Martins. You find all bibliographic references at the bottom of your handout. And he creates a structure to understand the history of anthroposophy. He says in the first, let's say, 40 years after Steiner's death, it's the time of the esoteric self-assurance. He calls it the time of the GA, that's in Gesamtausgabe collected writings. And it's the time where people collect nearly everything Steiner wrote and uttered. It was a high debate on who should be the esoteric follower of him, and it's a debate between, as always, some men who consider themselves to be important and a woman, Ita Wegmann, who was his, how do you say in English, Geliebte in the last 2 years. His love in the last 2 years. So you have a mixture of ideological, institutional, and very personal things. It's the time of creating this GA, this Gesamtausgabe, and it's the time where in the Nazi period you have a mixture of collaboration and being victim. In the 1960s, the situation changed. It's in Germany the time where Germans questioned a tradition which was not really where there was no real, let's say, Aufarbeitung discussion about the Nazi period. That's also a dimension which is present in the Anthroposophical society. And now there's an opening for social questions. There's political engagement and the Green Party in Germany, and there's a criticism of Steiner's authority. And that's an interesting time where a lot of new elements came into anthroposophy. I mentioned only one you might know or not, there are in Germany 1 university run by anthroposophists and 4 universities for applied science. There are a lot of enterprises who are foundations, and these foundations belong to anthroposophical milieus. For example, Blavatsky, they construe some needed things for cars. They have 70,000 workers. There's a software company, a software AG, and all the money and billions are part of the foundation for anthroposophical uses. So that all happens in these years after 1960, and in the 80s, I don't know whether there's really a keyword to describe what's going on, but it's an ongoing institutionalization. It's something which I would call a charismatic globalization that's exploding, and nobody knows what's going on there. On the other hand, there's dwindling membership numbers. So the Anthroposophical Society has huge problems. The number of the members in Germany declined from, let's say, 25,000 20 years ago to 15,000 today. It's the time of the beginning of academic research. And Ansgar Martin calls it an anthroposophical reformation. It's really difficult to describe what's going on, but that's the background of globalization. Point 4, what happens in this process of globalization? Now, before I come to some systematic reflections, I just want to give you some hints what's going on in the world, and it's my very personal impressions. And if you have from Argentina, from India, aspects to add, please feel free to do so and correct me. We have nearly no research on this process, except one big volume, which was published this year, which you find also in the bibliography by Anne-Catherine Hoffmann on Waldorf education, Waldorf movement. I didn't read all the stuff. I have the impression it's excellent. I'll give you one greater example and some minor ones, and a greater example is China. That's the Waldorf School in Guangzhou, which I visited in 2019 or 18, and it's an old reused building. Just one attempt to give you a very, very brief, again, idea of what is Waldorf pedagogy. And you find it on the handout. I think there are mainly 4 aspects which are pertinent. It's first a form of classical education. There's a much more Prussian tradition in Waldorf as we might know. Second, huge elements of reform education in the early 20th century. Co-education using school gardens, theatre, and so on. Scientific ideas of the late 19th century, evolution, theory evolution is an intrinsic part of the curriculum, and last but not least, theosophical ideas. For example, teachers should know about the reincarnations of their pupils. In 2004, now I'm back to China, there was the creation of the 3rd school in Chengdu, in Sichuan, that's just in the middle of China, that's one, and we have an excellent text of Yifan Sun. And this double volume on global Waldorf traditions, it's open access, free. He said that they started with a very unique program in China, but after 10 years, anthroposophists tried to integrate local regional Chinese traditions, cultures. They began to read Chinese texts. The beginning traditional Chinese painting was practiced. Traditional Chinese massage was used for the children. So it's a process of entangling this German tradition with Chinese tradition. Then you have institutionalization, so more or less 2018-20. When I was there were 4 or 5 schools which were licensed by the government, but about 100 schools which were not licensed. That means there was a growth to a 3-digit number, probably only a minority of these schools have been recognized officially. Now, Waldorf schools are trying to get the official license, and you can see that establishing a Waldorf school in China is always a highly political issue. The China Institute for Innovative Education at Beijing University, they created an own, I don't know what they really do to analyze, control, whatever, Waldorf education. And the research on Waldorf education created by anthroposophists had only a short time. Currently, we obviously see a decline of the interest and the existence of Waldorf schools in China. It's probably due to the tightened educational policy. It's what we realize in other fields concerning politics and Xi Jinping. But other problems pop up, which you find nearly all over the world. If you are trying to understand Waldorf traditions, you have only a very poor qualification of teachers. That's a huge problem in Europe, I know this as well. And parents were obviously disappointed by the quality of it. Then there was a high discussion about the COVID-19 policy. That's what you mentioned for Europe or Germany. We have similar things in China. Then it's just expensive. The tuition fees per year run around roughly $5,000 per year. So these are bits and pieces of a situation which is difficult to understand. And I have no really reliable knowledge about this political, educational, esoteric connection. I will finally give you one example in order to try to understand parents' motives. Why do parents send their children to Waldorf schools? And you know, or you have to know, that the Chinese educational system is a quite stress-loaded state system, especially at one point if you want to bring your children to university. And in this situation, Waldorf education reclaims to have a so-called holistic education with artistic education, handcraft activities, school garden. What we know what's practical parents also in European countries is stress-free education. But then you have in China the Gaokao. That's a test, an exam you have to pass if you want to enter the university. And it's that important that quarters and towns are called them to ask if there is an exam for pupils. And that means a lot in the Chinese cities where you often have a lot of traffic. And after the exam, the number of suicides among young people in China increases often dramatically. So that's just to indicate the status of this Gaokao. And then you have Waldorf schools. And what Waldorf teachers have to realize is that parents send their children not just to have a stress-free education, but to be better in the long run. That means they functionalized a stress-free education to deal better in a highly stressful system. And I have the impression they don't know how to deal with this very different aspects on the goals of education. Last but not least, last point to China, how anthroposophical is Waldorf education in China. Sun says, according to his views, he had in China that a lot of teachers would not necessarily consider themselves anthroposophists. That's an observation which I can make for you as well, and also for other fields of anthroposophical practice. Very nearby is a discussion about so-called quotation spiritual colonialism. Is the import of anthroposophical ideas just a new form of colonizing the world from the West? But I have no ideas who stands for which tradition in China. Now I give you much quicker some other ideas, just snapshots about the situation. We have a dissertation on Waldorf pedagogy in Taiwan from 1910. It's not really new, but you see on the left side folk talks from the Northern European tradition, which are part of the education. On the other hand, we have here a Buddha with Mora, or a Bodhisattva, I don't know really, which tries to integrate Chinese tradition here. What you see here, and what you will see in other pictures, is the use of pastel tones and the rejection of lines in painting. In behind, there is a very strict position of Steiner who says lines, well, that's demarcation between the sensible and the super-sensible world, but these areas with pastel colors, that's an option to have a better insight into a transcendental, super-sensible world. Here you have as well the same, well, imaginary, and here also a woman writing on slate, which they use because that's part of the tradition of contents of Waldorf schools. Here, that's also part of the so-called Epochenhefte. There are no schoolbooks in Waldorf schools. The teachers create contents by themselves. You see on the left side, the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci, Madonna by Raphael, Michelangelo's David, just don't know who's left and right. And in the center, it's the idea of scientific revolution. And you know from the history of sciences, scientific revolution was an invention in the 19th century. So what you see here is a very German basket of contents of education, I would say, of the late 19th century. Just to explain what Bernd Christian did with Eurythmy, that's what's in practice here. And they use central elements. For example, Eurythmy is a very body-distant form of dancing. You cover your limbs, you don't touch. It's an attempt to eliminate the corpse from dancing, but inevitably being forced to use it. And you see this silk kindly here, or this things. And it goes back to Steiner, the idea that these clothes represent the ethereal body, a subtle body, and they use it in Europe. That's Satyakala Nikita, And you see what pupils are doing here. They are painting in the way Steiner decided paintings had to be done. And they try to differentiate very small details. Here another image of the school. If you look on image Steiner on the left side, or that cover of the American Journal for Wildlife Education, you realize that you have strong identity markers in this field. You can quite easily identify anthroposophical paintings from all over the world. USA, and just another snapshot. There you have the option to create a charter school. That's a state-run school financed by the state, but well, there are groups as Anthroposophy which are responsible for the contents and teaching and so on. That has become a quite successful project, but now questions are arising to what extent is public or private. Jewish parents fear that Christian tradition might be prevalent in the schools. Christian parents have the idea that that might be esotericism and superstition. And so a discussion has come up. And a good important point is that people often realize very lately what's in behind the anthroposophical tradition. That's not only education, but that it's really an esoteric tradition. Then you have France, totally different situation, a strong differentiation between religion and state, so-called separation, and it's extremely difficult for anthroposophical schools to exist. There has been a parliamentary report where anthroposophy has been claimed to be sect, and they went to court. And now anthroposophy is no more part of the sects which have to be observed by the state. So it's extremely difficult for them to exist there. And most of the Waldorf schools are in Protestant areas of France, in Alsace. Another snapshot, that's the Waldorf school in Zander in Norway. And you might think, okay, that's a nice cupola, two of them, but you have to know that the first central building, the Johannesbau in Dornach in Switzerland, had also these two cupola. And then you can realize that the school in its architecture relates to this building where central rites of the esoteric school was supposed to happen. In Iowa, there is the Maharishi Yogi University in USA, and there you find a training for farmers who want to do dinner practices. And I don't know how it works. It's just there. And I don't know what happens. Israel spoke of it, and there are a lot of Waldorf schools. They are very well, and there's just in the last years a debate about what's about Steiner's anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, and the interviews with founders of these schools made very clear they just didn't know that was a part of anthroposophy. They had the idea that, well, Waldorf is stress-free. And if you go to Kfar Raphael, that's, well, a village for people with handicaps, you see these very Christian kind of background here, angels in the way of painting. There you might know some of these guys. They are all active in research and esotericism. On the left side, that's there's kitchens present as we enter explore suits from Israel. Egypt, There is Sikkim. That's an agricultural enterprise. What I have heard, all Egyptians who visit this institution are very fond of it. They try to use alternative agricultural methods to avoid the many problems they have in Egypt, water and so on. But if you see on this map, you realize that it's not only a farm, but it's a whole institution of, well, institutions, what they call research. Until here, the Heliopolis University, it's not so big a thing, but you see, you have the idea anthroposophy needs to cope with everything that's just in the old. One thing I should say, because it's interesting for this globalization process, the founder of Sikkim is Ibrahim Abu-Reish. He was married to an Austrian woman. It's very good in German, was very good in German. And he wrote a lot of texts you can read in German. And there, Stein's Christology plays an important role. But then he had to publish texts in Egypt in Arabic. And I had a student who wrote just small pieces on that. And it became very clear that this Christian Christological dimension plays no role at all in the Arabic texts of Ibrahim Abu-Reish. So you see again this tension between, well, different cultures if you know. Last point, Christian community, that's a church created by Steiner, and Steiner claimed that the German text should never ever be changed, perhaps in 300 years. But now they translate the text, and in different cultures, of course, cup or candles or bread or whatever you use in the Eucharist texts have very different connotations. And it's a huge debate going on in the Christian community, what to do with translations. So these are my snapshots. And now I come to my last point, where I hope to give you some systematic ideas how to deal with anthroposophy from 5. First question, what's about esotericism in practice? I would say the attractiveness of anthroposophy lies not in esotericism, but in practice. People often even don't know that there's an esoteric background. They are interested in what everybody, I suggest, is interested in, to have good food, good medicine, whatever. We need an intersectional research to differentiate between the amount of esotericism and the amount of practical dimensions. I would never ever say it's one or the other, black and white. It's an intersectional combination of these dimensions, and we don't have any research on that, and it's not easy to do that. I would propose to use the concept of centrality by Stefan Huber, Steve Byrne, who tries to analyze religious groups and their identification with contents and their activities by the gradualization of terms. And that's, for me, a promising way if I don't want to be killed by the question, is it religion or not? Is it esotericism or not? This gradualization or gradualization is, for me, an important part, also my own. That means it's important not to identify things, ideas, topics, but to identify its position, its importance, its significance. And that's difficult in our jobs. Can what I did give you some snapshots, but I'm nearly unable to say what's the importance of what practice or what idea. And our fixation on texts is a real problem. Second point, social structure. There are integrated some of the questions I wrote in the abstract. You might have read or you might have not read. One question is, who controls the transformation process? My simple answer is nobody. Nobody. Don't have the idea that there's a central part and there's everything, nothing. Normally, there are people who are engaged in these things, who find theater schools nice, and they do it. And have accompanied two foundations of schools in Germany, and they realized that there was an anthroposophical background. I would say when it was too late to change the direction. Another, dimension of the social structure, I would say it's something like a globalized educated class. We are perhaps just the group, the social group, who might be open for these dimensions. That's the reason why nearly everybody knows something about anthropos. We have these groups of parents who are quite rich, who are interested in the education of their children, and who have an idea of the marginal utility, marginal utility of some strands of education. And therefore, these life reform elements are always that present in the community. I just mentioned two social dimensions. From its tradition, anthroposophy is deeply called by Protestant traditions. You have to keep that in mind if you analyze Steiner and the text and his reflection, but we have no research in it. Second point, last point, there's a difference between the Anthroposophical Society as an association with legal rights, the Anthroposophical movement. The movement, you don't have civic membership, open boundaries. And this combination between an association and a movement is, in my perspective, one of the important elements which might extend stability and the expansion of anthroposophy. Identity and universality, last point. It's interesting that anthroposophy is quite stable in the process of globalization. And in my abstract, I wrote questions, how do cultural contexts change anthroposophical practices? Or in another sentence, what happens to Steiner's journey between ideas? And I propose to use an older scholarly work by Ulrich Werner, who is the biologist nearby here. And he made a very simple but useful distinction between system and elements. What? System and elements. Elements. System, I would call it a grammar, basic ideas, the structure, the architecture of the Weltanschauung. And the elements are all these things, reincarnation, ethereal body, what you have in anthroposophy. And I have the impression that might be a discussion, worth discussion, that the system remains quite strong, such as Steiner's philosophy and his philosophical views. But, and now it becomes difficult, the elements remain also strong if they are flagged out as identity markers. One identity marker is reincarnation, and that has a strong position until now. What's very difficult for me to understand is to what extent do we have a process of selection. There are elements in anthroposophy which are used no more. For example, Steiner claimed that what's the English? Lie. It's lead. Yeah, that's it. That should be used for people with weak bones. Lead. Yeah, thanks. But that's toxic. Okay. And they don't use it anymore. Steiner's writings, they don't use it anymore. So That's a difficult process. It's not easy to analyze instrument elements, but that should be a way to have a more complex access to the transformation of studies. Then progress. You have to know that Steiner considered himself part of the human progress to divinization or spiritualization of the world. That means anthroposophists come into other countries, they have the idea, we have something for you. We are part of the evolution which is leading to a better world. On the other hand, in the background you have this negative utterings of Steiner. For example, Chinese are passive, the white race is shaping the future, and all these utterings which are becoming quite difficult. I mentioned them here only not to indicate that in the background of anthroposophy, you have an idea of 19th century evolution, social Darwinism, we might call it. And if anthroposophists are in another country, they have their idea with them. Last point, hybridization. Of course, Theosophy and anthroposophy is a system with, I would say, combinatorial power. You can't and do combine a lot of things. And central are hierarchical processes. So you indicate the point of the culture in this whole system. And there the whites are up and the Negroes, Neger, that's the term Steiner uses, are down. And here we have to analyze how this process of hybridization works with regard to power elements. It's not just a nice word where you accept Indian or Jewish elements, but you have a power structure in behind which you have to analyze on the level of Steiner's ideas, but also what are anthroposophists doing concretely. If you want to have a science school in India, you have to have the acceptance of Bund der Freien Waldorf being association of free Waldorf schools in Stuttgart. And there things become very difficult. You don't have the right to do what you want. What can we do to understand these processes of intellectual history? I would recommend to read the introduction of a book, unfortunately in German, it's Martin Mulso über Reichweiten, published last year or a year ago. He's an expert on clandestine traditions in Europe, and he has created the idea of a global intellectual history. And for example, one element of this idea is something he calls in German Reichweiten, perhaps in English misreaches. What happens if you don't understand the culture, but interpret it in your own terms? So I like Martin Mulso very much. He's an intriguing intellectual, and that might be a way to have a fresh access to these a bit boring intellectual histories. What's my final sentence? I think the problem is that anthroposophists claim universalism and have a lack of insight into their actual particularism.